You are listening to Eat Meat Sparingly, a Word of Wisdom podcast. I am your host, Ali Essig. I am so excited to let you know that I will be speaking at Restore this year. It is September 26th through the 27th. And Restore is a Faith Matters conference. It's where they gather over 5,000 individuals to listen to inspiring speakers, beautiful art, and incredible music. So make sure that you take advantage, not only by attending the Restore conference, but come and say hi. I will have a booth there. PlantWise will have a booth so that we can share all the goodness of eating plant-based foods with as many people as possible. And I would love to see you there. So grab your tickets at faithmatters.org. All right, today we are going to learn more about food and the environment. Now, this is just part one. Part one. We will do part two. I'm not sure if it's next week or in a few weeks. There's so much that goes into the environment. And I want to first address a lot of the questions that you have been asking first. So before we go into it, I think it's interesting to really take a deeper look to find out more about the demand for food and how that relates to our increased pesticide use. First of all, compared to the 1960s, we are eating significantly more meat. Significantly more meat. Back in the 1960s, it was a little bit less than like 100 million tons a year. And now we're getting closer to 300 million tons. It's a lot. It's a lot of meat. And what's interesting, actually, that surprised me the most is out of all of the animals, if you were to guess, what would you guess is the animal that is consumed the most? It's actually pig meat. Pig meat is consumed the most, and that's because of China. China consumes pig meat more than any other meat. And then in the United States, it is poultry. And then number 3 is going to be that beef and buffalo. And so as our consumption has increased, it has made a drastic impact on our environment. And a huge part of that is because of, honestly, it's the increase in population. It's the increase in population in the world. It's the increase in wealth in general, in urbanization. And the world has just seen this overall increase in food demand, coupled with a shift in our dietary preferences towards more resource intensive foods, which are animal products. They just require more resources. And so it has really impacted the environment. Now, in order to keep up with the demand, we are intelligent beings and we have created what's called genetically modified organisms. And in order to do that, we needed to mass produce, right? And so more than 95% of animals used for meat and dairy in the United States eat genetically modified crops. And these organisms are GMO crops. GMO crops have contributed to food production increases and higher food availability. Because of these GMOs, we can make more crops. We're not as impacted by bugs or famine or so many other things that can happen. And that did happen over 200 years ago. So the bigger question is, are these genetically modified organisms helpful or are they actually harmful? Well, since more than 95% of animals used for meat and dairy in the United States eat GMO crops, it's really used for those animals, right? These crops have contributed to food production increase and higher food availability. It's because of these crops that you can eat the animals that you have been eating. In order to have meat for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner, it takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of food to feed the meat. And so that is how it has been done, basically, is by those GMO crops. Now, GMO plants are also known as genetically engineered. And in most plants, genes are modified to become herbicide and pesticide resistant to increase crop yield. Now, most are used to feed these animals, but are also used in common ingredients like corn syrup, corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, and even granulated sugar. Fresh produce like potatoes, summer squash, apples, and even papayas have also used genetically engineered varieties. And so it makes you question, are these foods safe to eat? Are GMOs safe to eat for humans, for animals? What is the risk that we're taking here? Well, herbicide tolerant genetically modified crops have led to an increase in herbicide usage. So that's the biggest risk, is because we've created these herbicide tolerant genetically modified crops, that we therefore can actually use more herbicides. But here's the interesting thing is insecticides, right? So the insects, so insecticide producing GMO crops have actually led to a decrease in insecticides. So that's a great thing. That's a really good thing. So we're using less of those because of GMO crops. But when it comes to GMO crops, before I want to go deep into talking about glyphosate or anything like that, I first just want to ask the question, are these foods, is there something wrong with these foods? Are they better for you, worse for you? And basically, it's interesting because these specific foods and these crops have been selected for modification that can increase or even decrease the vitamin, mineral, or fatty acid content found in these modified foods. So, for example, a genetically engineered squash can have half the fat, has less iron, but actually an increase in vitamin A than the original squash. So, GMOs are not inherently bad. Like these crops, literally the fruit, the food that comes from these crops are not terrible for you. They're not bad. They're not going to create terrible health outcomes. That's why it's actually worked so well for so long. So it's nothing to necessarily be afraid of when it comes to the food quality itself. GMOs are more restricted in Europe than in America, and that's mainly due to regulations based on varying approaches on hazards and risks, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in a second. Now, there's no differences on incidences of cancer, obesity, diabetes, kidney disease, autism, food allergies, and even celiac diseases. So that's important to understand that these GMO foods, genetically modified foods, have not increased our cancer rates, our obesity rates, diabetes, kidney disease, autism, food allergies, celiac disease, right? For these specific foods that have been genetically engineered. Now, we can talk more about maybe the side effect of consuming more processed foods, that because we have all of these genetically engineered crops, then we can create more crops, therefore we can create more processed foods. And that's like a totally different story. We can also talk about, and we will talk about more glyphosate and how that plays a role. But the food itself, like a genetically engineered squash, doesn't have any negative effect on you. So that's just good to know. Now, it's also important to understand as we go deeper into this, what is the difference between a hazard and what is the difference between a risk? So a hazard is something that can just potentially cause harm. Like I know that sharks are hazardous, but if I stay on land, even though I know sharks are hazardous, I never really have to worry about that hazard. I'm on land. It's not going to affect me. I'm not in the water. However, if I swim in the ocean, then I know I'm putting myself at a higher risk of getting bitten by a shark than I would if I was just on land, right? Significantly. It's the hazard plus the exposure. I think that's really important, that it's hazard plus exposure. How much are you exposing yourself to these substances? That is where we really want to understand what our risks are when it comes to the environment and our modern food production. Hazards only become risk when there's exposure. So classifications like the IARC has made carcinogen classifications, and they make their classifications basically based off of hazard. And so because of that, some things, if we expose ourselves to them frequently, then we're going to have a higher risk. But if you're not necessarily exposing yourself, then the hazards there, like asbestos. If I'm not exposing myself to asbestos, I don't have to worry about it being a carcinogen. And so for them, there's the group 1 carcinogens, which is carcinogenic to humans. It's like a known carcinogen. And then a group 2A is a probable carcinogen to humans. So probable versus known. Okay. So here's the question. Now, I first want to give you some like a backdrop on what glyphosate is and why people are talking about it a lot, and what really is our risk and what has a bigger risk. Does glyphosate have a bigger risk for as far as our health goes, as far as cancer goes, as far as heart disease goes, or does meat pose a greater risk? What is going to pose a greater risk for this? So let's start with the history and background of glyphosate. So glyphosate was first synthesized in 1950, but its herbicidal properties weren't actually discovered until 1970, and that was by a Monsanto chemist. And Monsanto brought it to market in 1974 as Roundup. Now, how does it work? It basically blocks a certain pathway that makes it essential for certain plants to grow. And this pathway doesn't exist in humans or animals, which is part of why it was initially thought to be very safe for animals and humans. And its main use is just a broad spectrum herbicide, meaning that it kills most plants. And this has made it revolutionary for farmers and gardeners because it could wipe out weeds without tilling. And it has had a mass adoption, especially in the United States. Its use has skyrocketed, and it started to skyrocket in the 1990s with the introduction of genetically modified Roundup ready crops. And this is soy, corn, cotton, canola. And basically, these genetically modified crops, soy, corn, cotton, and canola, were created so they were resistant to Roundup. So you could spray Roundup everywhere and it would kill everything except for the soy, the corn, the cotton, the canola. And so it could survive the glyphosate spraying, and farmers could spray entire fields without harming the crop. That means it's a huge yield. It made it so that they could produce so much more food. Now, when you think of that, you're like, oh, soy, corn. Maybe I should be avoiding soy because of this. But truthfully, the soy foods that I'm consuming, the soy foods that are made for human consumption, are not these same soy foods. This is the soy and the corn that's fed to animals. This is so that we could grow a ton of crops for animals so that we can eat more animals. Okay. I cannot stress that enough. We do not need to stress about soy. We do not need to stress about any type of soy that I'm buying, any type of tofu, tempeh, TVP, soy curls, any of that I'm buying from the grocery store is not going to be this Roundup ready crop, genetically modified. It's all organic most of the time anyway, but it's nothing that you need to stress about when you're buying your soy milk. This is totally different. These are the crops that are fed to animals. So they could make a ton of food to feed to animals. So today, glyphosate is the most widely used herbicide in history. Right? It's applied in agriculture, forestry, lawns, and even used to dry crop like wheat and oats before harvest. This is called desiccation. So these little trace residues are often found in food, but also in water and even in human urine samples. And so the question lies, is that increasing our cancer rates? We've seen cancer rates go up higher and higher and higher. And so is this one of the causes? Could this be one of the issues? And in 2015, the IARC, so the International Agency for Research on Cancer, classified glyphosate as a group 2A. Okay, so that means that it's probably carcinogenic to humans. Now, they did this based off of the hazard, not just the hazard plus exposure, but the hazard, right? And it was limited evidence in humans, but mostly the farm workers. So all of these workers, as they're spraying their crops, they're exposed at a significantly higher rate than the average American, and they have a higher increase in non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And so it was sufficient evidence, even in lab animals, and strong mechanistic evidence in DNA damage and oxidative stress in some studies. Okay. On the other hand, in 2016, the World Health Organization, they had a joint meeting on pesticide residues, and they concluded that glyphosate is unlikely to pose a carcinogenic risk to humans from dietary exposure. Meaning like normal food residue levels are considered a very low risk when it comes to cancer. So why the difference? The IARC evaluates hazard, like I said, and the World Health Organization evaluates risk. Meaning, is it just a shark, or is it like it's a shark we should all avoid, or should we only avoid sharks if we're swimming, if we're putting ourselves in that water? Meaning that it's different for farmers who's spraying it on the land. Like that exposure is going to be totally different, and that hazard and that risk different than the average human who's consuming foods with small little bits of residue. I hope that makes sense. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to cancer, what do you think increases your risk of cancer more, glyphosate or meat? Well, according to the World Health Organization, who evaluates not just the hazard, but also the risk, also consuming it, how much we are exposed to it. And they have classified higher than just a group 2A, they've classified processed meats as a group 1A carcinogen, meaning that it is known to cause cancer. When you're eating bacon, sausage, right? When you're eating beef jerky, when you're eating lunch meats, all of these things that there's so much talk about glyphosate right now. And I think for good reason, I don't want to ignore it completely, but we're missing the bigger picture. We're missing the fact that we are consuming foods that are known to cause cancer every single day. When you love your bacon, that's a group 1 carcinogen. Now, what about the same level as the IARC, the group 2A, or a probable carcinogen to humans? What is classified in that area? And that is going to be red meat. Red meat, okay? Red meat is pork. Red meat is beef. Red meat is lamb. So every time you're having lasagna with beef, every time you're having your pork chops, that is a group 2A. That is in, just to give you a picture, that is in the same category. When you choose to have that for dinner a couple times a week, you are exposing yourself to something that's in the same category as those farmers who are spraying this herbicide on their crop. Imagine that. Think about yourself. You know, you would not expose yourself to that if you could, if you're not a farmer, if you didn't have to do that. So why would you expose yourself to this day in, day out, every time you sit down and eat your food, your dinner? It just blows my mind how we talk about the environment, we talk about all these things, and we just gloss over the fact that we are exposing ourselves to carcinogens every single day, every single day. So again, just to wrap up everything on glyphosate, I think it's important to just consider your personal risk to GMOs and glyphosate. Okay. So 3/4 of all processed foods contain GMO ingredients, and traces of glyphosate can be found in most conventional foods. So it's important to understand that if you want to avoid your risk, we should probably be avoiding processed foods. Processed foods, if we can avoid them, if we're going to minimize our risk in general. And the more foods that we're eating in their whole food form, it's going to be so much better. But it's also important to remember not to let fear of one single component of food override the general benefit of a food. Food prices are on the rise, and it will not always be possible in every circumstance to choose organic or local. And the benefit of consuming plants and plant-based products is a synergistic experience, and most likely has more overall benefit than harm to you. It is also important to remember that ideally, the focus on whole plant foods will cut out a lot of the highly processed foods that are likely to contain residues of herbicides or even pesticides. So eating that way will already reduce any potential exposure. Minimize your exposure to processed foods, right? And then you'll see that huge difference when you're eating a mostly whole food plant-based diet. If you feel that it would be best to suit your health concerns to reduce your exposure to glyphosate, then here are some suggestions. Number 1, try to buy organic wheat bread, organic rolled oats, or organic old-fashioned oats, organic beans, organic lentils, and or organic wheat pasta. Okay, and if you feel that it would be best to reduce your exposure to genetically modified foods, here are some tips. First of all, I want to confirm again that soy products that are designed for human consumption, like soy milk, tofu, tempeh, they're all non-GMO based and do not need to be organic to avoid it. So no stress there. Most of the genetically modified soy and other feed is fed to livestock. Genetically modified corn fed to livestock. So minimizing animal-based products will minimize your exposure to secondhand consuming GMOs. So another thing you can look out for is the certification of foods not being genetically modified. Typically says non-GMO. Foods like canola oil, sugar, papaya, squash, potatoes, and apples, they're going to be the foods that are most common to most likely be genetically modified. And so you can look for those labels if you want to minimize your exposure. But in general, I want to finish up this thought about organic farming in general, that the appeal for homegrown produce is captured as best. And it's true. It really is. It's best with a local farmer selling their food at a farmer's market straight to the consumer. And it is fantastic if you can do that. But here's the thing. How sustainable is that in today's modern world? Can we assume that most small farmers are using organic farming methods? Maybe. But organic foods are not necessarily pesticide free. The protocols used to test products for pesticide residue are incomplete and don't detect all organic pesticides. So, conventional farming also frequently uses organic pesticides. Organic farming methods aren't necessarily better than conventional methods, as it requires more land and even more manure to use. However, it does serve soil quality better. So organic farming usually does improve soil quality. So if you want to support organic farming, organic methods because of the soil, then go for it. I think that's a great reason to do it. But it's important to understand that organic foods themselves are not necessarily healthier. Their nutrient profiles in organic versus conventional are the same. Unlike genetically modified foods, which their nutrient profiles are different, not necessarily better or even worse, but just different. Organic, non-organic, and organic, they have the same nutritional value. A strawberry that's organic, a strawberry that's not organic, same nutritional value. And I would argue that the nutrition of the food overweighs not eating the food because it's not organic, for sure. The label organic does not address the food safety or nutrition of the food. The health benefit of an organic food over its conventional counterpart has not been substantiated through research. However, it was found through observational studies, not very strong ones, but some observational studies, the eating patterns of those who purchase and consume organic foods tend to also make other healthier food and lifestyle choices. Therefore, they tend to be healthier. If you can afford it, if you're more mindful of it, you're probably just a healthier person in general. Now, what about the Dirty Dozen list? Now, the Dirty Dozen list is created by the Environmental Working Group, the EWG, and is updated annually. They have a list of the top 12 foods based on the Pesticide Data Program, PDP, from the United States Department of Agriculture. So the Environmental Working Group processes this PDP data and sums up the number of pesticide residues on each food type, regardless of the chemical, its concentration, or its specified tolerance levels. Now, here's the takeaway. You don't need to avoid the Dirty Dozen. Our food supply is perfectly safe. The benefits of eating fruits and vegetables far outweigh any risk of any pesticide or herbicide. Okay. The benefits far outweigh any risk. For example, based on the Dirty Dozen list, it would take approximately 181 daily servings of conventionally farmed strawberries for a child to reach the top of the no adverse effects level for strawberries. No child's eating 181 strawberries a day. It is generally viewed as safe. And again, the benefits always far outweigh the risk. But again, this is your choice. So decide what is best for you in your season of life. So when left with the choice, always choose whole foods, regardless of whether they're organic or not. The nutritional benefit from consuming whole food that's plant-based will exceed its organic or conventional label. Remember that all foods have value and that living a predominantly plant-based diet makes room for you to appreciate all kinds of foods that optimize your body's potential. Remember that all foods especially if they're plant-based, are going to benefit your body, prevent cancer, prevent disease, prevent all these things, even if they have residues of herbicides and pesticides. Wash your plants, wash them in water, rinse them off, all of those things. If you really care about the environmental aspect of the soil and how organic is better for the soil, then I get it. If that's, your purpose and your reason, then definitely choose those types of foods and that will make a difference. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention as I close up this episode is while I'm talking about controversial subjects, why don't I just talk about seed oils? Let's talk about seed oils for just a second. Right now, a lot of people in the health field are saying how seed oils are terrible for you. But truthfully, when it comes to your risk of cancer, when it comes to your risk of heart disease, when it comes to your risk of these top causes of death, seed oils are not the cause. What is going to increase your risk of cancer more? Eating meat or seed oils? The answer, you guessed it, eating more meat. What's going to increase your risk of heart disease more? Meat or seed oils? You guessed it, eating more meat, right? That's number one. Same with diabetes. I could go on and on. But here is where it can play a role. It's not the seed oil's fault. In general, the nutritional profile, let's take canola oil, for example. Canola oil, since it is a genetically modified food in the sense of in our modern society, it has been Roundup resistant so that they could spray a ton of Roundup on it and produce a ton of canola oil. Canola oil is basically just like a plant, like a flower. It's like a yellow flower. And it's the seed that is left over from it. So it's these bright yellow flowers that produce small pods containing these tiny black seeds, and the oil is extracted from the seeds. Canola oil is widely used in cooking, baking, salad dressings, all these other things. And the reason why canola oil is so popular is because you can cook it at high heats, right? The leftover seed meal, just in case you want to know, is after the oil extraction, it is super high in protein and it's actually fed to livestock, as all things are fed to livestock so that we can produce as much meat as we're producing. Now, some canola oil is used in like biodiesel and lubricants and all those things. Now, the nutrient profile of canola oil, it's about 93 to 94% unsaturated fat, with a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. Is lower in saturated fat compared to many other oils. And that is why it's actually more heart healthy. It reduces your risk if you're going to eat beef tallow or canola oil, which right now there's this big push towards let's use beef tallow when we're making French fries. First of all, French fries are terrible for you, regardless of the oil that you're using. It doesn't matter. It's not health promoting. It's not a health promoting food, period. It doesn't matter if you switch out the oil. It's not going to be heart healthy in any way. But what's worse in French fries, using canola oil or using beef tallow? Beef tallow. Beef tallow is actually worse because it's high in saturated fat. It's going to increase your risk of cancer, increase your risk of heart disease, higher on all of the ways. We could go deep down that rabbit hole. But in general, the controversy and the concerns about canola oil really stem from its processing. It's really refined, it's bleached, it's deodorized, and it involves high heat solvents like hexane. Around 90% of canola oil is grown in Canada, and the US is genetically modified to tolerate glyphosate, the Roundup, which ties to its concerns about herbicide residues that may be on it. And there's all these debates and people arguing that it's terrible for you, that it's the reason why obesity has increased. It's like they're blaming our obesity crisis on seed oils. Here's the thing. While I don't think it's healthy and I don't think it's like, yes, just go, let's go drink oil now. In general, we are pointing at the wrong cause. The real debate really, yes, okay, there's oxidation from the refining and the high heat processing and maybe prolonged storage that can cause these polyunsaturated fats to actually oxidize, which can produce compounds that can be linked to inflammation. But this is a side effect and something that is not a direct cause. It's not a known direct cause. It is something that when you're eating a lot of processed foods, that it can cause your more inflammation, which can increase your risk of diabetes. It's really about how these highly refined oils often end up in processed foods, which tend to be nutrient poor and calorie dense. So the health impact may come more from the overall dietary pattern than from the oil itself. And I cannot stress that enough, that you thinking that, oh, I actually bought my food from this really healthy place that doesn't use seed oils. It's not really making that big of a difference. Really, it's not a big deal if it's using, I don't know, olive oil versus canola oil in your veggies at this restaurant. Like yes, it's higher in calories, no matter the oil you choose, than if you were just to cook from home. Where the risk lies is usually in the fact that it tends to be these refined oils these seed oils often end up in processed foods, which are nutrient poor and calorie dense. That's the problem, not the oils. And it's so easy to kind of point, oh, it's this fault and this fault. And the thing is, as we're pointing to all of these reasons and all these issues, we're missing the biggest thing, which is the fact that we're eating so many animal products. If we were to reduce our consumption of animal products and not replace it with processed foods, like that's actually going to be worse. There were studies that have been done that have shown if you turn vegan, but then become like a junk food vegan, are you necessarily healthier? And in some aspects, you may not be. In some aspects, you actually may have higher triglycerides, and it may not be necessarily healthier to eat more processed foods and less meat. But the best option is actually just consuming whole plant foods that are from this earth, like were intended from God, right? That these are gifts from Mother Earth, and to be consuming those foods. And so if you want to, just make an impact on the environment, a small impact on the environment, then yes, you can definitely consume more organic foods for the soil. that may be a reason. But for your health goes, we just want to minimize processed foods. We want to minimize processed foods. You want to eat as many plant foods as possible, organic or not. And then when it comes to wheat, because I'm going to have people ask about wheat. I have already had a lot of people ask about wheat. What about wheat? What about, is it healthier? Is it good for you? Is it worse? Is this something that I need to avoid? And the one other thing I want to say is that 200 years ago, we consumed wheat, but it was like a longer stalk, was a little bit different variety. It wasn't as an efficient way of farming wheat as we farm it now. And I don't know if it's necessary the fact that we're using a different type of wheat now than we did 200 years ago, or if it's just how we process our bread. We're using fast rising yeast. We're not using the slower type of yeast like you find in sourdough bread, where there's more fermentation, and the fermentation is so healthy for you. And that's going to be a fantastic option to minimize the amount of gluten. And the type of wheat that we have now versus 200 years ago has a little bit more gluten, which can make it a little bit harder for people to digest. But again, if you're consuming homemade bread that you're making that doesn't have all of these additives, that's going to be better for you for sure. But in general, even the processed bread, is it going to increase your risk of cancer? Is it going to increase your risk of heart disease? Is it going to increase your risk of diabetes? And truthfully, it's not. It's actually health promoting. It's actually going to decrease your risk. As long as it's not the refined version, as long as the whole food version is going to minimize your risk of heart disease by like 25%. It's going to minimize your risk of cancer as long as it's in the whole grain version. Even the processed whole wheat bread, as long as it's whole wheat that's in the grocery store with the additives, with all that stuff, it still is health promoting. And so it's so important to really take into consideration what we're putting on our bread. Like, are you eating toast with butter? That's a different story. That's a totally different thing than just the bread in general. And so it's really important to understand the bigger picture. And yes, our food has changed over the last 200 years. We grow so much more food. We have so many more people that we're trying to feed, but one of the reasons why we're trying to mass produce food is to feed the meat, is to feed the animals that we then eat. It is not efficient in any way. And so taking a deeper look at this is step one to understanding food and the environment, is to really start looking at, is this the most efficient way? And the reason why maybe we have all these herbicides and pesticides, because we're growing so many crops so that we could feed the animals. And I just want to kind of circle back to that before I go deeper into the environment and the impact of different animal products on the environment, which is a whole other story and super sad, but it is just something to take a look at. Can we be better stewards of this earth? Can we be better stewards by consuming more plants, less processed foods? Minimizing our risk of cancer is really going to come not just from minimizing herbicides and pesticides, which I'm sure can definitely help, but the biggest bang for your buck is going to be consuming meat more sparingly, period. And it's going to help the environment more because you're not having to feed the meat, if that makes sense, and grow all those plants, feed the meat. And another thing that someone mentioned in a previous episode, when I talked about animal welfare, they're like, animals are killed in farming regardless. If you're making all these crops, you're going to kill mice and you're going to kill birds. And I get that. But at least those birds had a chance to fulfill the measure of their creation and have joy and live outside and be able to open their wings. Unlike the birds that are making eggs and are stuck in battery cages that aren't even big enough to open their wings. That's the point. I'm not for absolutely no animals should ever die ever, not at all. I'm just for letting these animals, being good stewards over the land, letting animals fulfill the measure of their creation, have joy therein, being better stewards over what we have. The definition of stewardship is partnership. And how would God create an environment? How would he treat this world if he were here, if he were directing it? How would he treat farming? How would he do it in order to mass produce food for all of us, and the healthiest foods? If you think about it, what are the healthiest foods? They're going to be more plants. And I think if God were here directing this planet a little bit more, right, and teaching us how to be more efficient and be better stewards, I think it would look totally different. So just something to think about and to look at in the bigger picture of things. It's not about perfection, but it's about progress. And are we good stewards over this land? All right. Interesting topics. This is just part one. I can't wait for you to come back for part two, and then we'll go even deeper. But for now, we just touched on the environment. And I wanted you to really, when you look at health and when you look at people saying, this is terrible, this increases inflammation, all these things, everything increases inflammation. Okay. But does it, does it minimize your risk of heart disease, the number one cause of death? Does it minimize your risk of cancer, the number two cause of death? Does it minimize your risk of diabetes, the number three cause of death? Like, this should be the question. How does consuming these foods reduce our risk? Whether it's glyphosate, whether it's seed oils, whether it's anything else. And even if you're consuming non-organic produce, is that better or worse for your increase of your risk in those areas? And that's how we should look at it, instead of just minimizing everything, the inflammation, and assuming that that's terrible. Is it great? No. But what can you do? Do you have to be perfect? No. You can just eat 5 fruits and vegetables a day, eat an apple for lunch instead of processed foods, eat some watermelon, grab just whole plant foods for snacks. It's so simple, so dumb, it's so little. Swap out your meat for beans. It's really easy, guys. It's so much easier than you think, I promise you. And it's not only going to help your body, also help the environment. All right, stay tuned for part 2, whether it's next week or a little bit later. We'll learn more then. All right, talk to you later. Thank you for listening to Eat Meat Sparingly, a Word of Wisdom podcast. I'm your host, Ali Essig. And if you need more help and support with transitioning to eating more plants so you can lose weight and improve your gut health and just reduce your risk of chronic disease, then make sure to check out my Plant-Wise membership. That's PLANTWHYS, because I like to teach the why behind eating more plants. But if all you need is just a couple more delicious recipes that feed your family and everyone loves, and not to mention super simple and easy, then make sure to check out my YouTube channel, which is also Plant-Wise, PLANTWHYS. Hope to see you there.